This work is the first in a series of essays reviewing literature from the MIT course entitled The Emergence of Europe 500 to 1300. In today's article, I'll be critically analyzing the Roman world transformed, 300 to 600, Chapter 1 of Barbara Rosenwein's A Short History of the Middle Ages. As indicated by the title, Chapter 1 deals with the time period historians refer to as Late Antiquity, roughly occurring between the years 300 to 600 and coinciding with the rise of Christianity, integration of provincial Romans, and ultimately the fall of the empire. While the author does a quality job of briefly outlining many of the forces at play in such a complex epic, there are some glaring blind spots that I'd like to address. The early Roman Republic was founded in 509 BC, and initially only Rome's wealthiest families, the patricians, held power, and only they could hold political or religious offices. Slowly but surely, Rome expanded until the year 31 BC, when Augustus Caesar proclaimed himself the first emperor of Rome. By the time of late antiquity, the Roman Empire encompassed the entire Mediterranean, stretching from Morocco to Egypt in the south, and from Turkey to Spain in the north, even reaching all the way up into England. All the regions outside of Italy were referred to by the Romans with an air of superiority as the provinces. Late antiquity is defined by a radical transformation of political, military, economic, religious, and cultural power from the traditional hub of Rome into the aforementioned provinces. At the time, the old elites of Rome regretted the changes taking place. The provincials, on the other hand, embraced the changes. This transformation seems to have been precipitated first and foremost by calamities within Rome itself. Declining birth rates and an epidemic around the year 251 to 266 were the canary in the coal mine for the doom that awaited the empire. As a result of the lack of manpower, new recruits for the military were brought in from Germania and elsewhere outside of the realm. For many years prior, Germans had been temporary mercenaries for Rome, but now they were given land and settled permanently within the empire. This all came to a head in what is known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, a period where Rome went through over 20 emperors in only 49 years, and was constantly under siege from barbarians to the north and Persians to the east. In order to cope with the mounting internal and external pressures, radical changes were instituted. First, Emperor Valerian, who ruled from 253 to 259, shifted the imperial residence and mint from Rome to Milan. Soon, Trier, Sardica, Nicomedia, and Constantinople, which was then called Byzantium, joined in overshadowing Rome. In a similar vein, Emperor Gallienus, who ruled from the year 253 to 268, forbade the senatorial aristocracy, who were the old elites, from leading the army. Men from the ranks were promoted instead, and they brought with them their provincial proclivities. Christianity was also ascending the old pagan order, and in futility, government persecution of Christians began in the decade of the 250s. With a dying gasp, Rome debased the currency, causing hyperinflation, increased the taxes, and took control of the economy, confiscating uniforms and forcing artisans to work in weapons manufacturing. The Emperor Diocletian, hailing from modern-day Croatia, would go on to officially divide the empire into 4 parts. Emperor Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 and hailed from modern-day Serbia/Bulgaria, he brought the immediate crisis to an end. Constantine meant to restore the old empire, but the result was very different. The ascension of Constantine marks the beginning of late antiquity. Constantine was the chief architect of the Edict of Milan in the year 313, which was the official recognition of Christianity, bringing with it radical religious notions of morality and ethics originating in the, quote, dismal backwater of Palestine, the homeland of the Jews. This was likely precipitated by Constantine's attribution of his 312 victory at Milvian Bridge against Emperor Maxentius, which he attributed to the God of the Christians. Constantine converted, built churches, and gave priests special privileges. He renamed the ancient Greek city of Byzantium to Constantinople and presided over the first ecumenical church council in the year 325, known as the Council of Nicaea. This brings me to my first contention with the original text. Rosenweins includes virtually no discussion of Roman paganism, brushing it off with a deterministic Abrahamic vigor. Of course, Roman paganism was essential to the foundation of the civilization, informing all aspects of life, both public and domestic. Specifically, it had an embedded hierarchy which reflected the natural law. The author briefly mentions how, in the beginning, Romans were indifferent to Christianity, and then she skips several hundred years into the future when Christianity was already on a fast track to becoming the official religion of the empire. The absence of a discussion on the specifics surrounding the ascent of Christianity is quite telling. Virtually all the early converts to Christianity were Eastern slaves and women, something the author conveniently leaves out. As Celsus, a 1st century Roman encyclopedist, points out, Christians show they want and are able to convince only the foolish, dishonorable, and stupid, only slaves, women, and little children. Rosenwein's writing drips with Christian moralism, briefly mentioning how Christianity attracted provincials who, quote, never had the chance to feel truly Roman. Without ever analyzing whether this segregation was good or bad policy, or if it was ever even possible to make them Roman without fundamentally debasing what it meant to be a Roman. In fact, much like the Roman currency was debased by hyperinflation, Roman identity was debased by universalism. Another aspect that the author fails to consider is that this was a conscious subversion. As articulated by Mark Brahman and Richard Spencer in their work on Gem, Christianity was consciously crafted by provincial Jews in order to demoralize and subvert the Roman Aryan civilization. There are many esoteric parables in the Bible that convey this fact, but that's a discussion for another day. As the author points out, the Romans never insisted that conquered provincials give up their beliefs. They simply added Roman gods into the local pantheons. There were many unique personal, household, and local gods, but everyone, except the Judeo-Christians, participated in festivals of public cults, which gave a certain rhythm to the year. In this sense, the Romans were quite tolerant. It wasn't the Romans persecuting the Jewish God, but rather the monotheistic Judeo-Christians refusing to honor the Roman gods. It's hypocritical to refuse to pay taxes and then complain when the IRS knocks down your door. Similarly, it was quite hypocritical for the Judeo-Christians to benefit from the fruits of Roman civilization, all the while refusing to honor the public Roman gods. It would be another story altogether if the Romans committed to a global crusade, stamping out Judeo-Christianity wherever it reared its ugly head. But as the author points out, the Romans were even somewhat tolerant of the Palestinian Jews' refusal to honor the Roman gods, seeing it as a particular stubbornness of the Jewish race. One can imagine a scenario where Christian converts moved to Palestine to practice their odd faith, but of course they went for the jugular instead. This culminated in anti-pagan legislation enacted in the year 391 to 392 by Emperor Theodosius I, and Christian mobs smashing local pagan temples. The chapter goes on to describe the various Christian disagreements that came to the fore after paganism gave way, describing the years 350 to 450 as the era of competing doctrines. Arianism is mostly mentioned, along with a few others, but this part of the chapter is ultimately not very notable, as these debates take on a universal nature, devoid of any Roman particularities. The second contention I have with the chapter is in the author's comparison of classical Roman art to later provincial art. She describes the former as, quote, self-absorbed, with a feeling of depth, movement, atmosphere, and evoking common mythical tales, and the latter is described as abstract, decorative, and not interested in classical beauty. As far as I'm concerned, the provincial art is not concerned with any beauty standard. Take a look at this sculpture, used as an example of provincial art in the chapter. This woman is horrendously ugly, with hair that looks like the springs from a trampoline, massive eyeballs that could scare an erection off of the most promiscuous sexual deviant, and a unibrow that stretches the lengths of space and time. One does not need a college degree and an esoteric analysis to understand that art like this is simply inferior to classical sculptures such as this one, of Perseus slaying Medusa, who I like to imagine as representing the aforementioned ugly tramp. Real art is objectively beautiful, but as the author acknowledges, the new provincial art brought with it teaching and preaching, instead of being a window to the private world. Healthy people don't want a schoolmarm lesson when they view art. Rather, they want to be inspired by beautiful forms. But Judeo-Christians jumped on the new art form, appropriating it as it saw fleeting value in the, quote, city of man. This brings us now to the infamous barbarian invasions. In the 3rd century crisis, Black Sea Goths plundered nearby Roman provinces, with the Romans first pursuing peace through bribery, only later pursuing direct confrontation. The Goths split into the Ostrogoths, north of the Black Sea, and the Visigoths in Romania. By the mid-330s, the Visigoths were allied with the empire, joining the army, and by the end of the 4th century, certain Roman units consisted entirely of barbarian tribes, like the Goths and the Franks, fighting as federates. This fell apart after the Mongol-Hun invasion of the Black Sea in the year 376, later moving into Romania. Emperor Valens, who ruled from 364 to 378, was subsequently petitioned to allow Visigoth refugees into the realm. He accepted, but the number was unprecedented, with as many as 200,000 entering, leaving the Romans overwhelmed and resentful. The Romans ripped off the Visigoth refugees in trade, causing a Visigoth revolt in the year 378 that culminated in the killing of Emperor Valens. Visigoths returned to the federates, seeking new land in the year 397. First Greece, then Italy, Rome, and eventually Gaul, south of the Loire. By the year 484, the Visigoths had control of most of Spain. In 406, Alans, Vandals, and Sueves crossed the Rhine to get their own piece of the decadent pie. Vandals eventually crossed into North Africa, but the Sueves stayed in Spain, only to be conquered by the Visigoths in the 6th century. This chapter provides a quite accurate historical account, but I would strongly push back on the idea that Romans didn't understand racial differences. The author says, quote, "There was no biological distinction between Germanic traders and Roman ones." Roman historian Tacitus's famous work Germania, in the year 98, tells a very different story. He writes, "In my opinion, the Germans are the original inhabitants of the country, and are almost entirely unalloyed by admixture with immigrant tribes from without. He goes on to say, thus, what was originally a name given to a tribe, Germans, and not that of a race, gradually came to be accepted, so that all men of the race were called Germans. Furthermore, he says, for myself, I am disposed to side with those who hold that the German peoples have never intermarried with alien stocks, but have always stood forth as a race rooted in the soil, pure and unlike every other. Obviously, Romans understood racial differences. It's not surprising in the context of political correctness that a contemporary mainstream author would try to obscure this fact. Maybe she's just uninformed, but I doubt it. After the barbarians invaded, life changed radically. In the new order, city life declined and the countryside became the center of civilization. The urban middle class virtually disappeared, being impoverished by new taxes that rich rural landowners simply refused to pay. Taxes then fell on poorer people who, when couldn't afford to pay anymore, became slaves on the rich rural estates. By the 7th century, the kings gave up and stopped trying to collect general taxes altogether. The active, long-distance trade of the Mediterranean slowed down, and wealth was increasingly based on land ownership. In the Eastern Byzantine Roman Empire, the barbarians were not as successful. The emperors still had considerable authority, and the towns and middle class enjoyed a renewed prosperity and influence. Elites went to Constantinople, and tax revenue was collected more efficiently than ever. When the Hagia Sophia burnt down, Emperor Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, hired 10,000 workers and used 40,000 pounds of silver to decorate the newly rebuilt church. But by this time, the Eastern Roman Empire was becoming a Middle Eastern state, more similar to Persia than to Gaul. Icons, perhaps from Coptic Christians of Egypt, were a Middle Eastern product, crucial to the Byzantine culture. Many laws were passed, and they were more robust than those passed in the Western kingdoms, although they had little impact on Western law until the 12th century. The Eastern Empire eventually took North Africa from the Vandals in 534 and some of Spain in 552, but was catastrophically defeated in Italy by the Ostrogoths in a long war from 535 to 552. And this sums up Chapter 1. In conclusion, it was a very accurate historical account, but the author suffers from some stereotypically modern philosophical blind spots that prevent her from analyzing the beliefs of the Romans in a truly objective way.